Hi, everybody. I am really, really excited about today's topic, and it's called resistance training, working with high conflict people. This is a chapter in my upcoming book. You see the little ticker down there, From Conflict to Courage, How to Stop Avoiding and Start Leading. The very reason for the title was that I started seeing so many people in leadership, and even people that aren't in leadership, avoiding conversations rather than working through the difficulties. And as I've done this work for a long time, I've really worked on my own patterns, and a lot of my work comes from what's practical, what works. I've been in the field a long time with this, and so it's a little bit different than everything else that's out there. And we're going to be doing 2 sessions on resistance training. This one is a kind of an overview, and next week we'll do a little deeper dive. So I want to invite you, if you're here with me, because doing this, I can't tell who's here unless you introduce yourself. And so if you don't mind, introduce yourself, tell me where you're from, or you can tell me how we met. And as you know, I'm practicing on this streaming tool and learning how to put your name up there and look for comments. It's a little bit of multitasking, but and I don't love to multitask, but this requires it. So thank you for showing up. Hey, Susan, old friend. It's great to see old friends. And as you can see, I see some people that say LinkedIn user, but I don't know who you are, and I don't know why that shows up like that. But if you want to tell me your name, that's great. Glad you're here. There's a new thing we're trying with this LinkedIn. If you're a LinkedIn instructor, which I am, they're allowing me to create an event, and they're posting it. So therefore, I'm getting people from all over the world, which is really, really exciting for me. Here's a good friend of mine, Gail. Thanks for showing up. Here's someone else from Saudi Arabia. Wow, what time is it there, I wonder? This is really, really exciting. Another friend of mine, someone I've worked with. Another person from my past. Gosh, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for showing up. I'm going to keep trying to let people know who's here, recognize you. And so I want to go on and get into the content, and I'll try to multitask and answer questions as we go. And if you're watching this not live, you're watching it from the video, please go ahead and post if you've got questions or comments. I try to look at that the next day. So very excited to be here. And so we're going to talk about resistance training, and I call it resistance training because it's something you have to learn. Because, over the course of our lives, this is the truth. We are going to work with colleagues, employees, bosses, people that are very difficult to get along with, or who we view as resistant. And that's a term that I use to change the language a little bit. I know I do talk about high conflict people, but you know what I'm talking about. The people that just seem kind of disagreeable. You'll resist them because you feel this inner conflict when you work with them. I've certainly been in those situations, not only in the workplace, but with my spouse, with my mother. We all have people in our lives that we identify as resistant. And I'm mostly going to talk about that today. And then next week, I'll talk about the 3 types of resistance and how to see where you are with all of this. And so, hey, Philip, nice to see you. Hi there, Shireen. Thank you. We've been talking back and forth on the direct messaging. So let's talk about the agenda for today. We're going to talk about what is resistance, how it shows up, why transformation really trumps change in this instance, and how to kind of see the situation differently. Because if you're leading, you've got to have the courage to deal with resistant situations, or else you're going to be miserable in your role. Now, I want to talk about some ways that we identify negative people. And if you want to jump on here and say what you think is resistance for you, I'm glad to post. If I can see you, if I can multitask, I'm going to probably have to get someone to help me with this back end piece. But I look at it as someone that's negative, someone that's always in a negative vibe. And there's a thought process out there of just avoid negative people. But I don't approach it that way. And here's why. If I'm going to avoid negative people, that means I'm going to avoid myself sometimes, because I've been negative. We all get negative. That's human. When we're more elevated, we learn how to not be so negative, or how to shift our mind, how to take control of it. But the truth is, you're going to have family members that are negative. You're going to have colleagues that are negative. You might have a boss that's negative. So you need to learn how to work with that. Then there's the argumentative people. Those are people I used to avoid, especially very aggressive men. I felt afraid. Now, just a little secret, I grew up with a dad that was really aggressive. Some of us have had kind of dysfunctional backgrounds. I've forgiven a whole lot of things, but let me just say that we get programmed to be afraid of certain things. And if we're going to lead, we're still going to be with those kinds of people. And we have to learn how to be okay with that. Another one for me is someone that's really closed-minded. And so if someone's closed-minded, I dread to bring up my idea because of the energy that it takes to actually have that conversation back and forth. And so a lot in this book is about how to build what I call conflict capacity. In other words, instead of feeling so drained, like I can't do this conversation, I have the capacity. I already know they're going to resist. I know they're going to be closed-minded. I know they're going to argue, and I'm okay because I have the capacity. And I also know how to use timing to my benefit. If I'm at capacity and I'm tired, I'm clear enough to avoid that conversation momentarily so that I can have the capacity when it really matters. And so what do we do when we see and we have to work with resistant people? Well, what we do, and I talked about this in another video, if you want to check out YouTube, I'm starting to collect my YouTube channel. I'm collecting all the LinkedIn Lives I do so that you can access any of the little lessons or conversations there at any time. Use it, it's free stuff. If you like it, if it's valuable to you, you can share it with your staff, your employees, your colleagues, have conversations about it. But what I've learned is that there's three kind of patterns that we have as human beings when we're around who we think is resistance. And it's all really avoidance, but you can identify it by avoidance, aggressiveness, or appeasing. And so, like sometimes this is why emotional safety is so important in relationships, and to learn how to tamper yourself down if you're kind of an aggressive person. What you want to be able to do is to understand that avoidance is just there because you're avoiding whatever pain you're feeling. And sometimes we get aggressive back because that stops it. So these three patterns that we have, we would rather avoid something than to deal with it. I know that I used to have a really aggressive boss. We'll talk about power structures next week. It depends on if it's a colleague, it equals power structure, an employee where you're above them, or a boss that's above you. But I've had bosses that if I needed a day off, I'd rather just call in sick. The resistance was just too difficult. But it was that very moment when I was at factory worker and I worked with a really difficult boss that I had the vision for doing what I'm doing now. And I thought, if I can't learn these lessons from this position, I'll never be able to teach it with real power. And I did that while I was there. And here I am 20 years later teaching what I learned many, many years ago. And so I'm going to share some of that with you. And I'm going to ask you this. Do you have anyone that you're resistant with in your own family? I know that there's been times when I've wanted to do something and I knew my husband would say no, or he would disagree. And instead of hanging in the conversation, I would just feel resentful and I wouldn't ask for what I wanted, or I wouldn't open up the dialogue because I just felt like I didn't have the energy. Or I would make a decision and apologize later. So how many of you do that? I mean, some of us, that's what we do. Here's one. Any tips on working with a narcissistic, toxic boss? Yes, absolutely. And that will be in the book. And I've talked a little bit about my boss that I had. One of those tips is that we can't resist their resistance. And I'll talk about that next week because I'm going to talk about the three kinds of resistance. But here's my philosophy now. And I used to be from the camp of avoid negative people. My philosophy is we're all here to learn and grow. And sometimes that person that feels like your nemesis, feels like your most toxic person, is really there to help you get courage, help you to grow, help you to gain capacity. So now I look at people as that's just who they are. It's how I'm experiencing them. And the only thing I can change is myself. And so I want to talk about, because I said I would talk about why transformation trumps change. A lot of times when we're talking about resistant individuals, we are trying really desperately to make them different. And we'll try different techniques. We'll avoid, we'll get aggressive, we'll be manipulative, we'll be sarcastic, we'll punch them back. But really, that doesn't work. It just creates more resistance. And so what I have found, and this is one of those tips for narcissistic bosses, is that you have to learn how to accept people for where they are and also offer the opportunity for them to change. And so that's hard. That's a whole other lesson. But we're right now kind of talking about identifying these resistant people and knowing what it is and building the capacity, because you've got to be able to stay in the conversation. So I'm going to give you my definition of resistance, and something that I've worked with for a long time that I call stuck in the sand, SAND. So my definition for resistance. Now let's apply this in a broad sense, and then let's take it personally, because a lot of my work is very transformational, and it's about you growing inside as a person. When you do that, it's amazing how you can shift other people, but you can't shift other people first. So resistance, my definition is it's the non-acceptance of what is, and it's the inability or the unwillingness to make another choice. When we look at people and we see them as resistant, and we notice by their behaviors, and we start resisting them, we are now also in resistance. It's really difficult not to be, but resistance is the non-acceptance of what is. And my five or four pieces of resistance that I'm going to be explaining more in depth in the book. Now let's take this from a personal level. Stuck, attached, negative, and distracted. I'll say that again. Stuck, attached, negative, and distracted. When you're stuck in your life about a decision, that's resistance. Should I? Shouldn't I? Should I have the conversation? Yeah, but if I do, they're going to say this. Yeah, but if I don't, this is what's going to happen. Should I move to another country? Should I take this other job? Should I ask for what I want, or should I just do it anyway? That is resistance. That's about decision making. Okay, so we all get resistant in our decision making. And then attached, I need them to say yes. I need them to understand. I need them to be a different way. I need them to stop being so negative. I need my idea to work. I believe in commitment, but when you get so attached that you're not open to another idea, you really stop the flow. And then there's negative, stuck, attached, negative, and distracted. So I'm going to talk about distracted, then I'll go back to negative because I've got a story for you. And so when we're distracted, that's when you're in conversation. Let's say it's you as a leader and an employee. When we're in resistance with someone, let's say you're trying to give a performance conversation some feedback, and you start to give the performance feedback, and then they say something like, well, that's not fair, and you need to know what everybody's saying about your leadership. That's the island called it's not fair. You're trying to get them to the island called improve your performance. If you take the distraction, it's because there's resistance and you resisted their resistance. If they say that's not fair and you get into a conversation, well, it is fair. No, it's not. I knew you'd say that. That's verbal ping pong, and now you're distracted. So I do a lot of work with leaders on avoiding the distractions and staying on topic, to be able to say something like, that could be, but what we're talking about now is your performance. We can certainly have a different conversation about the fairness of this later. I want to hear you, but let's go back to what we're intending to talk about. So distraction is a sign that you've gotten into resistance. Now I want to talk about negativity, because that was something I used to focus a lot on. I studied it. I understand negativity spreads like a virus, and that when you get negative, you are wiring your brain for more negativity. You know, we think over 60, 70,000 thoughts a day, and 80% of those are negative or repetitive. That stuff is out there. That research is out there. And I'm not the type to just recite research all the time, because I think that people that are interested in this will research it. And I'm giving practical advice and things that work in the field. But you can research negativity and how your brain gets wired for it. But I started looking at myself, because every time I start to train on this kind of stuff, I say, am I a good example of what I'm teaching? Do I try to live it? And what I started noticing was how often I am negative and without realizing it. And here's an example of resistance. And I'm sharing this story in the book. I share it a lot of time in my presentations. I was at an arts fest, and it was in October, and here in the Ozarks where I live, Springfield, Missouri, usually the fall is fairly cool. It's nice, but it can be different because we live in the Ozarks, and it can be beautiful one minute and it can rain the next. It can be snow in May. So the weather is unpredictable. But on this day, I went to the art fest and was looking at some of the arts and crafts. And I said out loud to a friend of mine that was with me, I said, man, it's really hot. She said, yep, it is. About 3 minutes later, I went, God, I'm burning up. She said, yeah, it's warm. And then I said, man, that sun is burning a hole in my head. And then I realized I'm talking about something that is not going to change. And it was almost as if an audible voice said to me, get in the shade or go home. And I realized how often we human beings resist what is. We don't make friends with reality. We want something else to change and we don't see our choices. My choice was to have dressed differently, brought an umbrella, not go, get in the shade, come back in the evening, had lots of choices, but instead I'm griping to someone about that can't change the situation, about something that can't be changed. So a lot of my work is about transformation. How can I stop being a resistant person? How can I let other people have the resistance, be in the presence of that? And that's part of like my courage training, my resistance training, is learning to have a tolerance for some of these things with yourself and with other people. And so the more that we complain, the more that we avoid. This is why I'm all about growing internally so that you have the capacity, because the more that we complain, the more we avoid, we grow new neural connections for the purpose of continuing that same pattern. So I'm going to check in with everybody just for a second. Hey, burn bridges, can't handle the negativity. Me too. I have a story about that where I told someone off because of their negativity. Hey, David, another friend of mine, just because you choose to behave that way doesn't mean I have to participate. That's empowerment. Exactly. Here's Roll. Aggression can be handled, but how can one handle stubbornness and dominance? Oh my goodness. I'm just going to give you a little hint here about that because it is hard. The first thing is don't resist their dominance and their stubbornness. And so I use a magic phrase, and this wasn't intended to be part of today, but I'm going to give you this. The magic phrase that moves the needle, I call it the fulcrum point of change, is would you be willing? So what you can do right now is start to practice with the stubborn people, and they say, absolutely not. Don't get into ping pong. Don't get into, well, you ought to. Well, let me tell you why. Just say, well, would you be willing to hear a different point of view? Now, they're probably going to say, if they're really stubborn, they're going to say, absolutely not. Would you be willing to next week? Would you be willing just to hear one idea? All you're trying to do is move the needle. You're not trying to win. You don't care if they move the needle or not. When willingness is the fulcrum point of change. And what I mean by that is that nothing changes until someone is willing. And you have to be willing to accept their stubbornness first. Because if you're attached to them changing, that already creates resistance. And so when I was working with my difficult boss, I would say, would you be willing to hear another side? He would say, well, I will, but there's not enough time. And I'd say, would you be willing to take the time later? They're always going to throw up obstacles. That's a whole other lesson. But since you asked about dealing with the very, very resistant, stubborn people, you need to make a game out of this at some point and just seek, especially at a higher level, because you can tell your employees what's what. But when you're dealing with the power structures, being able to get someone to be willing whenever they weren't previously, if you move the needle just a little bit, then you created movement. And that's the idea of it. Someone says something here. Let's see what you're saying. If your manager is using the distraction on you, and I want to overcome that. So if your manager is using the distraction, you want to say, well, wait up just a second. I want to go back to what was the original intent of our conversation. Very glad to discuss that. But you said we were talking about X. The one with clarity always navigates the ship and everyone else just shovels coal. What if your senior thinks he knows it all and has a problem with you all the time? Well, that's difficult. That's a whole other conversation. And I hear you, Dr. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but I see you. That is asking for feedback. Like what I've observed, for example, what I've observed is that when I come to you, you seemed irritated. Is there something I need to know? That's a question. So that's a technique. We'll be talking about a lot of those in the book. Here's the thing. We often don't ask for feedback, though, because we're afraid of what we're going to hear. And so when you're doing this kind of work, you have to be willing to feel that pit in your stomach and to say, okay, it could be bad. It could hurt my feelings, but I'm going to stay focused. So that's where you need to go with that, is that you've got to notice your own resistance. Yes, Gerald, get curious instead of resistant. Yeah, we've seen that one already. Okay. What about those that don't resist verbally and just shut down and not participate instead? I would ask, like, have I given them emotional safety? And so you might just be able to set a pattern and say, listen, I can tell by what's happening here that this may be difficult to process. Would you be willing to come back and have the conversation next Thursday at 2:00? And then you reiterate what you want. I want us to come to a decision. I want to support you. When you start to speak to the vision, you're not in the resistance, because resistance is about the past and resistance is about the distraction. And I find many companies thrive on conflict. I don't know that they thrive. I think it's unconscious. There may be some thriving, but I try not to judge it as it's intentional or that they like it. I don't know if they like it or not. We get into patterns. We judge people and we judge companies sometimes by saying, well, you meant to do that or you enjoy that. Most of us, if we find the better way and find a higher level of consciousness, it's so fulfilling. It's so joyful that once you experience the other, you don't thrive it. So that would be my answer to that. They may, but I want to just check in with my assumptions that it may seem that way. But here's what I've learned too. I think in sometimes I've thrived on it and not known it because we get addicted to emotional patterns. But as I grow, there's less of it in my life because I have the capacity for it. I'm not afraid of it. And when I am afraid of it, that's my place to learn. And so that's kind of how I interpret all this. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about breaking the spell. And thank you all so much for your participation. I wish I was a better multitasker and could get to everybody. Here's one more I'm going to take. How can I find the balance between staying in the conversation or knowing that there's a dead end and giving up by just being a listener? I'll do something in the future, Alina, on radical listening. If people have shut down, there's no more conversation. And sometimes we have to build enough space, and we have to have this balance between building the space to let someone speak, but also actually guiding the conversation so we are knowing where we're going in the conversation versus it's just all over the place and we don't have an end destination. I am going to be talking a lot about leadership clarity in the book and how to set that intention of here's what our end goal is for this conversation. Because if you wing it or if you buy into the idea that we're all adults, you're going to really struggle. And I've done that so many times. I don't talk about anything that I haven't experienced myself. And that the tools I give are practical and they work and they're simple. So it's primarily about getting agreement on the intention of the conversation. And if it gets distracted, reiterate, I think we're getting off track. Keep your purpose of getting along and of supporting them and to withstanding the conflict. And you'll see a lot of movement there. Yeah, the person who listens first controls the conversation. That is what I work on. And just the other day, I had a little bit of a difficult conversation. I gave some feedback to someone that is someone that I pay for a service, and I knew there would be defensiveness. And here's one of the ways that you deal with it. If you already know what they're going to say, be willing for them to say it. Instead of going, oh, they'll say this and then I'll hate it. They'll say this and I'll just listen. And they were defensive, and I can't share this here because it's too personal, and I'm very protective of my clients, my friends, the real conversations that go on. But whenever there was defensiveness, I said, wow, that sounds really difficult. I hate it that you feel that way. There was such a shock on this person's face, and it could have turned into an argument. It could have turned into hurt feelings. So the one that listens first controls the conversation, because most of us are just reactive. So I'm going to end here with just a couple of tips, and I'll check in with the threads later on and see if I can answer anything, or you're more than welcome to connect with me, direct message me on LinkedIn. If you've got a particular question, it'll give me content for future LinkedIn Lives. So we've got to break the spell. And how we break the spell is we stop giving it energy. If it's about the negativity, we stop giving energy to that negativity and we ask ourselves, what's our choices? If you're upset with someone, you quit talking about them to other people. You break the pattern is what you do. So if there's someone you're avoiding, you decide to take a breath and you're not going to avoid. And even if you don't get resolution, you've broken the pattern. And you're going to surprise that person, because people do what they do because it works. If someone's aggressive, they're aggressive with you because that works. It shuts you down. If you stand in their presence, as long as you're not going to get hurt physically, it breaks the pattern and they don't know what to do with that because it no longer works. So there's an old saying that people will treat you like, if you lay down, people will treat you like a doormat. So you can't be a doormat for other people. You've got to be courageous and calm and present and know your end result. So next week, we're going to talk about the 3 kinds of resistance. and how to further break the spell. And then maybe we'll do one with just questions. Maybe I'll do one where you send me questions. That would be really fun for me because I absolutely love to share this knowledge. It's my life's work. It helps people. It changes cultures. It helps people to be more courageous leaders. It helps you to get along and collaborate. And really, we need more of that. Our world is very divisive right now. So if those of us who see ourselves as leaders in some capacity, if we can guide the conversations, if we can set the vision, we can change cultures and we can change our worlds. Thank you so much for joining me and for all of your participation. See you next week.